The air in Buckhead, Atlanta, is different. It's thick with the scent of money, magnolia blossoms, and the quiet hum of ambition. Here, on streets named after old-growth trees and forgotten plantations, mansions stand not as homes, but as declarations. Their lawns are emerald carpets, their columns rise like Grecian tributes to success, and behind their stately oak doors live the kings and queens of Atlanta's black elite. It is a world of perfect pictures, where every smile is polished and every crack is paved over with gold. On a sweltering June afternoon, one of those pictures was about to be irrevocably shattered. The 911 call came in at 3:17 p.m., the voice on the other end a choked panic sob belonging to a teenage boy. When the first patrol car, a gleaming white Ford Explorer, rolled up the winding driveway of the Sinclair estate, the scene was one of jarring tranquility. Water sprinklers danced across the flawless lawn, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of ancient oak trees. It was the kind of place where violence seemed like a foreign concept, something you only read about happening in other, less fortunate parts of the city. Inside, the illusion died a brutal death. Vivian Sinclair, 44, the philanthropic saint of Buckhead, lay on a white silk rug in the grand foyer. Her body was a broken marionette, limbs twisted at unnatural angles. A gaping wound in her neck had turned the pristine rug into a grotesque canvas of crimson and cream. Her eyes, wide and unseeing, were fixed on the crystal chandelier above, a constellation of light that had witnessed her last, horrifying moments. The room was a maelstrom of destruction. A priceless vase lay in 1,000 pieces. Designer furniture was overturned, and the contents of a mahogany credenza were strewn across the floor. It screamed of a robbery gone horribly wrong. The first two officers on the scene, a pair of middle-aged white men named Harris and O'Malley, took in the scene with a practiced, weary cynicism. "Well," Harris muttered to his partner, his gaze lingering on the opulence around them, "looks like trouble found its way to paradise." He looked over at the boy, Andre Dre Sinclair, huddled on the marble steps, wrapped in a shock blanket. "Another domestic, probably. They make all this money, but they can't seem to keep their hands off each other." It was a quiet comment, spoken with the casual prejudice of a man who saw the world through a specific tinted lens. The assumption subtly colored their initial approach, slowing down the urgency to treat this as a high-priority homicide perpetrated by an outsider. 20 minutes later, Detective Gabriella "Gabby" Moretti arrived. A recent transplant from a homicide squad in Queens, New York, Moretti was cut from a different cloth. She moved with a purpose that felt alien in the languid southern heat, her sharp, dark eyes missing nothing. She wasn't impressed by the square footage or the zip code. She was a student of chaos, and the chaos in this room felt wrong. It felt rehearsed. "Stepson found her," O'Malley grunted, nodding towards Drare. "Says he came home from football practice and walked into this." Moretti knelt, careful not to disturb the evidence, her gaze sweeping over the scene. The overturned furniture was heavy, solid wood. Flipping it would have taken considerable effort and made a hell of a racket. The drawers were pulled out, but their contents, papers, silverware, were dumped in neat, almost deliberate piles. A real smash and grab was frantic, messy, and opportunistic. This felt methodical. It felt like a performance. She walked over to a shattered picture frame on the floor. The photo inside was intact, a smiling family. A tall, handsome man, Harrison Sinclair, had his arm around his beaming wife, Vivian. Standing beside them, slightly apart, was a younger Dre, a scowl etched on his face that contrasted sharply with his parents' perfect smiles. Moretti looked from the photo to the boy on the steps, then back to the carnage in the room. Robbers didn't take the time to create a symphony of destruction. They took what they wanted and fled. This wasn't about theft. This was about rage. It was a message, written in blood and broken glass. "Get the lab team to do a full sweep," she said, her voice cutting through the humid air. "Tell them to check for anything that seems out of place, even the smallest detail." She turned her gaze back to the body, to the woman who had been the radiant center of this perfect world. Someone didn't just want to rob Vivian Sinclair, Moretti murmured to herself, a cold certainty settling in her gut. Someone wanted to erase her. The question was, who hated a saint enough to turn her into a martyr? The Sinclair home, now cordoned off by yellow tape, had become a sterile, silent theater. Detectives and forensic technicians moved with quiet reverence, their methodical work a stark contrast to the emotional devastation that hung in the air. For Gabby Moretti, the house was a puzzle box, and her first task was to interview the two people who held the pieces, a husband who had lost his world and a son who seemed lost within it. Harrison Sinclair arrived in a blur of screeching tires and raw, unfiltered anguish. He was a mountain of a man, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit even in his distress, but his composure crumbled the moment he saw the flashing lights. He tried to storm the house, his voice a guttural roar of, "Vivian!" before officers gently restrained him. Moretti met him on the lawn, her demeanor softening from a sharp-edged detective to a compassionate stranger. In the back of a quiet squad car, away from the prying eyes of the neighbors now gathering at the edges of the police tape, Harrison's story poured out between racking sobs. He painted a portrait of a fairy tale marriage. Vivian wasn't just his wife. She was his anchor, his inspiration, the moral compass of their life. She was light, he whispered, his big hands trembling as he buried his face in them. Everyone who met her, they saw it. She dedicated her life to helping others. Who could do this? What kind of monster? His grief was palpable, a physical force that seemed to suck the air out of the car. It felt real, achingly so. Then came Andre. Moretti found him sitting in a different patrol car, staring blankly out the window. The hysterical boy who had made the 911 call was gone. In his place was a teenager encased in a shell of numb detachment. When Moretti sat down beside him, he didn't flinch. "Andre, I'm Detective Moretti. I am so sorry for what you're going through," she began gently. "I just need to ask you what happened." Dre recounted the events in a monotone voice, his eyes fixed on some distant point. He got a ride home from practice. The door was unlocked. He called for Vivian. He found her. The words were correct, the sequence logical, but the delivery was hollow. There were no tears now, just a tightly coiled tension in his jaw and a flicker of something dark and unreadable in his eyes. It was a stark, unsettling contrast to his father's unrestrained sorrow. "Was it unusual for the door to be unlocked?" Moretti asked. "Yeah, she was a fanatic about security," Dre said, his voice flat. "Always." "Did your stepmother have any enemies? Anyone who might have held a grudge?" A humorless smirk briefly touched Dre's lips before vanishing. "Enemies? Everyone thought she was a damn saint." The word saint was laced with a bitterness so sharp it was almost acidic. Moretti's internal bullshit detector, finely tuned by years in the cynical landscape of New York City, began to clang loudly. Grief manifested in many ways, but sarcasm was rarely one of them in the immediate aftermath of finding a murdered parent. "How was your relationship with her?" Moretti pressed, watching him closely. "It was fine," Dre answered, a little too quickly. "She was good to me. My dad loves her." He spoke of his father's love, not his own. It was a subtle but telling deflection. Moretti left the interviews feeling a profound sense of dissonance. On one hand, there was Harrison, a man utterly shattered by the loss of his perfect wife. On the other, there was Dre, a boy whose grief felt like a mask, hiding something far more complex and dangerous beneath. The pristine image of the Sinclair family, so carefully curated for the world, was beginning to show its hairline fractures. Later that evening, back at the precinct, Moretti reviewed the preliminary reports. No signs of forced entry. The security system had been disabled from the inside keypad an hour before the estimated time of death. Nothing of significant value appeared to be missing. Vivian's diamond earrings were still on her ears, and a thick wad of cash was still in her purse. The robbery motive was looking weaker by the minute. She stared at the family photo again, the one from the broken frame. Harrison's adoring gaze, Vivian's radiant smile, and Dre's sullen glare. It was a portrait of a happy family, with one glaring exception. People lie, but pictures sometimes told a sliver of the truth. Harrison had mentioned offhandedly that Vivian had been anxious about a routine doctor's appointment. It seemed insignificant at the time, a throwaway comment buried in grief. But in a case with no clear motive and a staged crime scene, the insignificant details were often the ones that mattered most. What kind of routine checkup made a woman like Vivian Sinclair, a woman who projected an aura of invincible grace, anxious? Moretti made a note. It was time to find out what secrets Vivian's doctor held. The investigation into Vivian Sinclair's life was like peeling an onion. On the surface, she was flawless. Her charity foundation was a beacon of hope in Atlanta's underprivileged communities. She hosted lavish fundraisers, graced the covers of local magazines, and was revered in her church. Friends, colleagues, and beneficiaries all spoke of her with the same breathless admiration. She was generous, kind, a true angel on earth. This public persona was a fortress, seemingly impenetrable. But Gabby Moretti knew that fortresses were built to hide something. Her request for Vivian Sinclair's medical records was met with bureaucratic resistance, but a judge's warrant cut through the red tape like a hot knife through butter. When the sealed envelope arrived on her desk, Moretti felt a familiar thrum of anticipation. She opened it, and the fortress walls came tumbling down. The clinical black and white text revealed a secret Vivian had guarded more fiercely than any jewel or fortune. For the last 5 years, she had been living with HIV. The records detailed a consistent, aggressive treatment with antiretroviral drugs. The anxious doctor's appointment Harrison had mentioned was a regular checkup with one of Atlanta's top infectious disease specialists. The discovery was a bombshell that reconfigured the entire investigation. The motive was no longer a mystery hidden in the shadows. It now had a name, a stigma, and 1,000 potential storylines. Blackmail, a jealous lover, an act of revenge from someone she might have infected. Moretti drove back out to the temporary residence where Harrison Sinclair was staying with his brother. She found him sitting alone in a dimly lit study, a ghost of the powerful man he was just days before. She laid it out for him, gently but directly. "Harrison, we know about Vivian's condition." The man's shoulders sagged, not in surprise, but in weary resignation. The fight seemed to go out of him, replaced by a profound sadness. "We were so careful," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I knew from the beginning. She contracted it from her first husband before I ever met her. It was a tragedy, another cross she had to bear." He explained the years of secrecy, the crushing weight of maintaining their perfect image in a community where reputation was currency. "Do you know what they would have said?" he asked, his eyes pleading with Moretti to understand. All her good work, everything she built, it would have been tainted. They would have whispered, judged. So we built a wall around it. I tested regularly. I'm negative. We were safe. His confession painted a picture not of deceit, but of a desperate protective love. He was complicit in the secret, but his motive seemed pure, to shield the woman he adored from the cruelty of the world. The image of the perfect marriage was replaced by something more complex and, in its own way, more human, a partnership bound by a shared silent burden. Moretti left Harrison with a sense of sympathy, but her mind was already racing ahead. If Harrison knew and was uninfected, the focus had to shift. Who else was inside their fortress of secrecy? Who else could have known? The lab at the precinct had been running the DNA of everyone in the immediate family against various medical databases as a matter of routine. It was a long shot, a fishing expedition. As she drove through the darkening Atlanta streets, her phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from the forensics department. The subject line read, "Urgent Sinclair Family Medical Flag." Moretti pulled over to the side of the road, her heart pounding. She opened the email. The report was brief, clinical, and utterly devastating. The system had cross-referenced Andre Sinclair's name and date of birth with public health records. 2 months ago, following a visit to a student health clinic for what he thought was a severe case of the flu, Andre had been tested. A follow-up confirmation had been sent to a private specialist, the same infectious disease specialist his stepmother, Vivian, had been seeing for years. Andre Dre Sinclair was HIV positive. The air in the car suddenly felt thin. This wasn't about blackmail or a spurned lover. This was a tragedy contained within the 4 walls of that perfect mansion. A sickness had been festering in the Sinclair home, far more insidious than any virus. It was a sickness of secrets and lies, and it had finally erupted in bloodshed. The question was no longer just who killed Vivian, but how a mother and son came to share the same devastating diagnosis, and why it ended with one of them dead on a silk rug. The revelation of Andre's diagnosis was a key turning the lock on a door Moretti hadn't even known was there. Suddenly, Dre's strange, detached grief and the acidic bitterness in his voice made a terrible kind of sense. He wasn't just a boy who had lost a stepmother. He was a victim, staring down a life sentence handed to him by an unknown assailant. Moretti was certain the two infections were connected, and she had a sickening feeling about how. To understand the son, she needed to understand his world. That world led her to Maya Jones. Maya lived in a modest but well-kept home in a less affluent but still respectable part of town. When she opened the door, Moretti saw the face of a girl drowning in a grief that felt more authentic than anything she'd seen from Dagre. Her eyes were puffy and red, her expression a mixture of fear and sorrow. "I know why you're here," Maya said quietly, leading the detective into a living room filled with family photos and high school trophies. "It's about Dagre." At first, Maya was guarded, fiercely protective of her best friend. She spoke of Dre in glowing terms, the charismatic football star, the funny guy who could always make her laugh, the friend she'd known since kindergarten. But as Moretti gently probed, asking about the last few months, Maya's composure began to crack. "He changed," she whispered, twisting a silver bracelet on her wrist. "Something happened, and the light just went out of him. The Dre I grew up with disappeared. When did this change happen, Maya?" The girl's eyes welled up with tears. "After prom. The high school prom." For most kids, it was a rite of passage, a night of awkward dancing, cheap corsages, and treasured memories. For Dre, it had been a demarcation line, separating the bright, promising before from a dark, brooding after. Maya recounted the night. Dre, newly single and feeling the pressure of his final high school season, had been determined to have a good time. He drank too much, too fast. "He was a mess," she said, shaking her head. Slurring his words, couldn't even stand up straight. His dad was out of town on business, so one of his friends called his stepmom, Vivian, to come get him. Vivian had arrived, exuding her usual calm, maternal grace. She'd helped a barely conscious Dre into her car and driven him home. That was the last Maya saw of the old Dre. In the days that followed, he went silent. He ignored calls and texts. He quit the summer football training camp that was supposed to cement his college scholarships. When he finally emerged from his self-imposed exile, he was a different person, hollowed out, angry, and consumed by a rage he refused to explain. "I begged him to tell me what was wrong," Maya cried, the words tumbling out in a rush. Finally, about a month ago, he broke down. We were sitting in his car, and he just told me. She took a shuddering breath. He told me he was sick, that he had HIV. Moretti remained silent, letting the weight of the confession fill the room. "I asked him how," Maya continued, her voice barely a whisper. "He wouldn't say, not exactly. He just kept staring straight ahead, and all he said was, 'She poisoned my soul.' I asked him who. 'Who did this to you, Dre?' And he just shook his head and started punching the steering wheel over and over again. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of unimaginable horror. A boy, drunk and helpless. A stepmother, the sole caretaker for the night. A shared secret illness. It was a narrative of profound betrayal, a violation hidden behind a mask of maternal concern. He never said her name," Maya sobbed, "but when I heard Vivian was gone, I knew. I knew it had something to do with that night." Moretti thanked the girl, her mind reeling. She now had a motive, a powerful, earth-shattering motive for a teenage boy to despise his stepmother with every fiber of his being. But a motive wasn't a murder weapon. She left Maya's house with a chilling certainty about what had happened to Dre, but a gaping hole in her case. On the night Vivian Sinclair was murdered, Andre Dre Sinclair had the most ironclad alibi imaginable. He was 50 miles away, on a football field, under the brilliant glare of the Friday night lights. He'd played the game of his life, scoring 2 touchdowns in front of a stadium packed with thousands of screaming fans. His every move captured on camera from a dozen different angles. He couldn't have laid a hand on Vivian, but Moretti knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that his hands were far from clean. He may not have been the one to strike the blow, but she was willing to bet her career that he was the one who had paid for the blade. Andre Sinclair's alibi was a fortress, as imposing and seemingly impenetrable as his family's mansion. Thousands of eyewitnesses, video recordings, and GPS data from his phone all placed him at the stadium during the entire window of Vivian's murder. He wasn't the killer, But Gabby Moretti was convinced he was the architect. If Dre hadn't wielded the knife, he'd hired the hand that did. To prove it, she needed to step out of the physical world of blood and fingerprints and into the shadowy digital realm where a 17-year-old boy could plot a murder with a few clicks. Armed with a new warrant, Moretti's team seized every piece of electronics from Dre's room: his laptop, his tablet, his gaming console, and his smartphone. At first glance, his digital life was utterly typical for a popular high school athlete. His social media was filled with pictures from games and parties. His browser history was a mix of sports websites, college applications, and homework research. It was a clean, curated digital identity, almost too clean for a teenage boy. "He's either a saint or he's smart enough to cover his tracks," Moretti said to Detective Miller, the department's resident tech guru. "My money's on the latter." Miller, a man who spoke more fluently in code than in English, got to work. He didn't just look at the surface. He dove deep into the machine's hidden recesses, pulling fragments of deleted files and cached data from the hard drive's memory. For 2 days, the search yielded nothing. Dre's digital footprint was pristine. Moretti started to feel a flicker of doubt. Had she misread him entirely? Was this all just a tragic, horrible coincidence? Then, Miller called her into the forensics lab. The air was thick with the hum of servers. On his monitor was a string of text recovered from a fragmented data packet that Dre's cleanup software had missed. "Found it," Miller said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. He used a privacy-focused browser, something like Tor, to mask his IP address. But he wasn't perfect. He did some initial research on a standard browser before he got paranoid. He pointed to the screen. The search history was a chilling blueprint for a murder plot. How to hire a hitman anonymously. Untraceable payment methods, dark web, best cryptocurrency for anonymous transactions. How to stage a robbery crime scene, police investigation techniques, home invasion. It was all there. The premeditation, the cold, calculated planning. The boy who presented a face of numb grief to the world had been privately, meticulously researching how to orchestrate the perfect murder. He wasn't just a grieving son or a tragic victim. He was a methodical plotter, leveraging the anonymity of the internet to seek his own twisted form of justice. The discovery was a massive breakthrough, but it was also a ghost. It was proof of intent, but not proof of action. There were no names, no email communications, no direct links to a killer. The dark web was designed to be a digital black hole, and Dre had used it skillfully. Moretti felt a surge of frustration. She could see the shape of the conspiracy, but she couldn't grasp it. It was like trying to catch smoke. She had a motive, she had intent, but she had no link, no weapon, and no killer. Dre's alibi still stood, a granite wall protecting him. She stared at the crime scene photos spread across her desk, the staged chaos of the living room mocking her. Dre had researched how to create this scene. He had planned it. The answer had to be there, somewhere in the physical world he had tried so hard to manipulate. The digital ghost in his machine had given her the why and the how, but the who remained elusive, a faceless phantom paid for in the untraceable currency of the internet. She kept coming back to one detail: the disabled security system. The code had been entered manually. That meant the killer had been let in, or he knew the code, and the lack of forced entry on any other door or window meant he'd left the same way. But what if he hadn't? What if, in his arrogance, the killer had made a mistake, a small physical error that a digital trail could never reveal? "Let's go back to the house," Moretti announced to her team. "We're treating it like it's day one. We missed something. I know we did." She had a feeling, a deep gnawing hunch that the key to unraveling Dre's digital plot wasn't on a hard drive, but somewhere in the dirt and shadows of the Sinclair estate. The investigation had hit a brick wall, and the sound of the impact was deafening. They had a powerful motive, a digital ghost of a murder plot, and a prime suspect with an unbreakable alibi. The case was turning cold, and the pressure from the DA's office and the media was mounting. Gabby Moretti found herself staring at the crime scene photos late into the night. The image of Vivian Sinclair's lifeless body burned into her mind. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, unable to see the way forward. That's when she decided to make a call that most of her colleagues would consider a sign of desperation. She called for the K9 unit. In the age of DNA analysis and digital forensics, calling in a dog team could be seen as an antiquated, almost folksy approach. Some of the older detectives on the force scoffed. "You're gonna have a dog solve a buckhead murder?" one of them had snickered. What's next? A psychic. But Moretti was from a school of thought that believed in using every tool in the box, especially when the conventional ones had failed. She knew that a trained dog's sense of smell was a force of nature, an organic detection system that could find traces of human passage that no chemical or computer could. The next morning, she met Officer Dave Jenkins and his partner on the manicured front lawn of the Sinclair estate. His partner wasn't a detective in a suit, but a magnificent 7-year-old German shepherd named Shadow. The dog sat patiently by Jenkins' side, his intelligent eyes fixed on his handler, radiating an aura of calm, focused energy. Shadow wasn't a pet. He was a highly trained specialist. "What are we looking for, Detective?" Jenkins asked, his voice calm and professional. "The killer didn't come through the front door, and he didn't force a window," Moretti explained, laying out her theory. "But the property backs up against a dense patch of woods. It's the perfect approach and escape route. I think our guy came in through the back, maybe through an unlocked window or door he was told about, and left the same way. We're looking for a scent trail, anything that leads away from the house and into those woods." Jenkins nodded. He knelt and presented a sealed evidence bag to Shadow. Inside was a piece of the blood-soaked silk rug, carefully preserved. The scent of adrenaline, fear, and human violence was a potent cocktail. Shadow inhaled deeply, committing the complex set of odors to memory. Jenkins gave a quiet command. "Seek." The dog began to work, his nose just inches from the ground, moving in a methodical grid pattern across the back patio and lawn. He ignored the scents of the gardeners, the family, the police officers who had trampled the area for days. He was searching for something specific, the unique scent of the intruder, contaminated with the violence of the crime scene. For almost an hour, Shadow found nothing. The sun beat down, and the hope that had flickered in Moretti began to dim. The sneers of her colleagues echoed in her head. Then, near a row of meticulously pruned azalea bushes at the edge of the property line, Shadow's behavior changed. His tail went rigid. A low, deep woof escaped his throat. He'd found something. He followed the scent trail away from the bushes, his pace quickening. It led them directly to a large window at the back of the house, a window to a guest bathroom. Moretti examined the frame. On the sill, barely visible to the naked eye, were a series of faint scuff marks. Someone had been clumsy. Someone had slipped coming in or out. From the window, Shadow pulled them away from the house, his powerful body straining against the leash. He led them not towards the street, but directly into the dense, dark woods that bordered the Sinclair property. This was it. This was the escape route. The team followed, their feet crunching on dry leaves and twigs, the air growing cooler under the thick canopy of trees. Shadow was relentless, navigating the tangled undergrowth with an unerring sense of direction. About 50 yards into the woods, in a small clearing hidden from the house, he began to bark insistently, circling a thick pile of fallen leaves and digging at it with his paws. Jenkins gently pulled him back. Moretti, her heart hammering against her ribs, knelt down. She carefully brushed away the leaves. And there it was. Half buried in the damp soil was a black, disposable burner phone. And next to it, tucked partially underneath a root, was a single crumpled latex glove. It was the break she had been praying for. A piece of the physical world left behind by a killer who thought he was a ghost, found by a partner who didn't need a warrant to follow his instincts. The discovery in the woods was like a lightning strike in the dead of night, illuminating the entire case in a flash. The burner phone and the latex glove were more than just evidence. They were the first tangible links to the phantom killer who had slipped in and out of the Sinclair mansion. Back in the sterile environment of the forensics lab, these discarded items began to tell their story. The glove was the immediate priority. It was a standard single-use medical glove, the kind you could buy at any drugstore. To the naked eye, it was unremarkable, but under the lab's powerful microscopes, it was a treasure trove. The exterior was clean, wiped of any prints, but the interior was a different matter. The technician carefully swabbed the inside surface, collecting the microscopic skin cells and sweat residue left behind by the wearer. When you wear a glove, especially when you're nervous or exerting yourself, You sweat, Moretti explained to a junior detective, her eyes glued to the lab tech's movements. Your hand becomes a little ecosystem in there, and that means DNA. The sample was rushed for priority processing. The waiting was agonizing. Moretti paced her office, fueled by black coffee and adrenaline. This was the moment of truth. If the DNA matched someone in the National Criminal Database, CODIS, the case would be blown wide open. They'd have a name, a face, a history. The call came 12 hours later. "We've got a profile," the lab chief said, his voice clipped and professional. "Male, but there's no match in CODIS or any other database we have access to. Whoever he is, he's not in the system." The news was a gut punch. They had the killer's genetic fingerprint, but no one to match it to. It was like having a key with no lock. The frustration in the precinct was thick enough to taste. They were so close, yet still so far. The killer remained a ghost, now with a DNA sequence instead of a face. While the DNA results were a dead end, the burner phone was slowly giving up its secrets. The tech team managed to bypass its primitive security features and extract the call and data logs. It was a ghost phone, as expected. It had been activated only 3 days before the murder, and had made only one outgoing call, to a number that was also a burner, now deactivated. It had been used to access the internet once, to check the balance of a cryptocurrency wallet. It was a digital dead end, a closed loop of anonymity. Moretti refused to be defeated. She took the evidence back to her desk, spreading the photos of the phone and the glove next to the crime scene shots. She stared at them, willing them to speak to her. She kept coming back to the woods. The killer had been careful. He wore gloves. He used a burner phone. He planned his escape route, but he'd made a mistake. He'd dropped the glove. Why? She imagined the scene, the killer, heart pounding after the brutal act, scrambling through the dark woods. He's peeling off the gloves, wanting to get rid of the evidence. Maybe he hears a noise, a car, a dog barking in the distance. He panics. In his haste, one glove falls from his grasp as he shoves the other and the phone into his pocket. He doesn't notice. It was a simple human error, a moment of panic that had unraveled his perfect plan. The single glove was a symbol of that panic, but it was also something else. It was a sign of meticulous preparation. This wasn't a crime of passion. The killer had come prepared to leave no trace. This level of forethought pointed directly back to the person who had the most to gain from a clean murder, the architect, Dre Sinclair. "He told the killer to wear gloves," Moretti said aloud to the empty room. "He planned every detail." She felt a new wave of resolve. The DNA in the glove might not have a name attached to it yet, but it was still a powerful weapon. They now had the genetic profile of the man who had physically committed the murder, and she was certain that if she could break the digital money trail, the anonymous cryptocurrency payment, it would lead her right back to Doctor, and from Dre, they could force the name that matched the DNA. The scent of betrayal was strong, and now, for the first time, she had a way to follow it. The digital trail from the burner phone had led them to a single data point, a cryptocurrency wallet. For the cyber crimes unit, it was like being given a treasure map where the treasure was locked in a digital vault in a country that didn't exist. Tracking cryptocurrency was notoriously difficult, a journey through a maze of decentralized ledgers and anonymous addresses designed to protect user identity. "It's Bitcoin," Detective Miller explained to Moretti, pointing at a complex diagram on his screen. "The payment was sent from one anonymous wallet to another. It's like watching cash get passed from one ghost to another. The transaction was for $10,000, a chillingly low price for a human life. The payment had been made 2 days before Vivian's murder. This was the murder weapon's receipt, but tracing the source wallet felt impossible. It had been funded through a mixing service, a digital laundry designed to shuffle and combine transactions from thousands of users, making it nearly impossible to follow a single thread back to its origin. For days, Miller and his team worked tirelessly, employing sophisticated software to analyze the blockchain, the public ledger, where all Bitcoin transactions are recorded. They were looking for a needle in a digital haystack. The investigation stalled again, caught in the web of an encrypted, anonymous financial system. Moretti, growing impatient with the digital dead end, shifted her focus back to the real world. "Forget where the Bitcoin came from for a minute," she said, pacing in front of Miller's desk. Where did the cash come from to buy the Bitcoin? You can't just walk into a bank and buy 10 grand in crypto without raising flags, especially not as a 17-year-old kid. This new angle was the key. They started investigating the on-ramps, the services where people exchange real-world money, fiat currency, for cryptocurrency. They subpoenaed records from every major crypto exchange, looking for accounts linked to the Sinclairs. Nothing. Dre had been too smart for that. Then, a junior analyst on Miller's team had an idea. He probably didn't use a major exchange. It's too traceable. He would have used Bitcoin ATMs. They're scattered all over the city in gas stations and convenience stores. Some of them have very lax ID requirements. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. They compiled a list of every Bitcoin ATM within a 20-mile radius of the Sinclair home and began pulling surveillance footage and transaction logs. It was a painstaking, mind-numbing process. After reviewing hundreds of hours of grainy footage, they found him. On a camera from a dingy convenience store 10 miles from Buckhead, a figure in a hoodie and sunglasses could be seen at the ATM. It was Dre. The footage showed him feeding a small stack of cash into the machine. It wasn't one large transaction, but dozens of smaller ones, spread across multiple ATMs over a period of weeks. He had been slowly and methodically converting his cash into an untraceable digital currency. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when they cross-referenced the dates and times of the ATM visits with Dre's financial records. They subpoenaed the records for the student bank account Harrison had set up for him. The statement showed a pattern of regular cash withdrawals, $300 here, $500 there. The amounts were small enough not to trigger any automatic alerts from the bank, but when added up over 2 months, they totaled exactly $10,000. It was the smoking gun. Dre had systematically drained his own savings, money his father had given him for his future, for college textbooks, for a car, for a life that was now destroyed. He had converted that future into a murder contract. The stark contrast was chilling. On one side, you had the futuristic, impossibly complex world of cryptocurrency and the dark web. It was a world of digital ghosts and untraceable transactions. On the other, you had the mundane, old-fashioned reality of a kid making regular withdrawals from his checking account. Dre's sophisticated digital plot had been unraveled by a simple paper trail. He had been so focused on the high-tech anonymity of the payment that he had forgotten about the low-tech origin of the funds. Moretti looked at the bank statement, then at the grainy photo of Dre at the ATM. "We got him," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Let's bring him in." The ghost now had a paper trail, and it led directly to Andre Sinclair's door. The interrogation room was cold and gray, a deliberate void of color and comfort. Andre Dre Sinclair sat at the metal table, no longer the detached, sullen teenager from the initial interview. Now he was visibly nervous, his leg bouncing uncontrollably under the table. His father's high-priced lawyer sat beside him, a stoic man in a $1,000 suit, projecting an aura of calm that Dre clearly did not feel. Gabby Moretti entered the room alone, closing the door softly behind her. She didn't carry a thick case file or crime scene photos. She placed a single manila folder on the table between them and sat down. She didn't look at the lawyer. Her eyes were locked on Dre. "Andre," she began, her voice even and calm, "we're not here to talk about Vivian's murder." Dre's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. The lawyer shifted in his seat, intrigued. "We're here to talk about your bank account," Moretti continued, sliding a single piece of paper out of the folder. It was his student checking account statement. "We're here to talk about a series of cash withdrawals you made over the past 2 months. $300 on April 12th, $500 on April 19th, another $300 on April 25th. It all adds up, Andre, to $10,000. She then slid a second set of documents across the table, grainy still images from the Bitcoin ATMs. Dre in his hoodie feeding cash into the machines. Dre stared at the photos, his face paling. The carefully constructed wall of denial he had hidden behind for weeks began to crumble, brick by brick. He looked at his lawyer, but the man's stoic expression had been replaced by a grim resignation. There was no spinning this. "It was for his future," Moretti said softly, her voice filled not with accusation, but with a strange, aching sadness. "Your father gave you that money for college. For your life. What did you spend it on, Dre?" That was all it took. The question, delivered with empathy rather than force, broke him. A choked sob escaped Dre's lips. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking. The lawyer put a hand on his back, but it was too late. The floodgates had opened. "She ruined my life," Dre wept, the words muffled by his hands. "She took everything from me." For the next hour, the full horrific story poured out of him. He recounted the night of the prom in fragmented, painful detail. The drinking, the blackout, the feeling of being carried to his room. "I don't remember all of it," he stammered, his voice thick with shame and rage. "But I remember waking up, in the middle of the night. The room was dark, but the bathroom light was on. And she was there, in my room, fixing her clothes. She just looked at me and smiled, like nothing happened. She told me to go back to sleep, that I'd had too much to drink." At first he convinced himself it was a drunken nightmare. But then came the sickness, the diagnosis, and the horrifying certainty. He knew it was her. He knew she had passed her own dark secret on to him, a cruel and twisted act of violence disguised as care. "I tried to get her to confess," he said, looking up at Moretti, his eyes raw with pain. "I hid cameras in the house. I wanted to get it on tape to show my dad, but she was too smart. She'd just laugh at me. She told me no one would ever believe me over her." He confessed to everything else, the dark web research, the slow conversion of his college fund into blood money, the hiring of a low-level criminal he'd found on an anonymous forum. He gave them the man's name and contact information. He had orchestrated the whole thing, from the method of payment to the staged robbery. "I just wanted justice," he whispered, the fight completely gone from him, leaving only a hollowed-out shell of a boy. "She was a monster, hiding in plain sight. My dad thought she was a saint, and she was a monster. I had to make her stop." In the sterile gray room, the line between victim and perpetrator blurred into an indistinguishable smudge. Dre was the mastermind of a brutal murder, a cold and calculating planner. But he was also a child who had suffered an unspeakable betrayal, a victim whose life had been stolen from him on the night that was supposed to be a celebration of his future. Moretti listened, her professional detachment warring with a profound sense of human tragedy. She had her confession, and the case was all but closed. But there was no triumph in it, only the quiet, sickening weight of a family utterly destroyed from the inside out. With Dre's confession, the final act of the Sinclair family tragedy began, and it was played out under the harsh, unforgiving lights of the police precinct. The name Dre provided, Lamont Jones, a small-time felon with a history of assault, was quickly located and apprehended. Faced with the evidence of the Bitcoin payment and the DNA from the glove, Lamont confessed within an hour, his story perfectly matching Dre's. The mechanics of the murder were now laid bare. The who and how were solved, but the why still needed to be shown to the one person who remained lost in the fog of grief and disbelief, Harrison Sinclair. Moretti knew this would be the cruelest part of her job. She had to show a man that the wife he worshipped was a predator and the son he adored was a killer. She arranged for Harrison and his lawyer to come to the station under the pretense of an update. They sat in the same gray room where his son had confessed just hours earlier. "Harrison, we've made an arrest in Vivian's murder," Moretti began, her voice gentle. A wave of relief washed over Harrison's face. "Thank God," he breathed. "Who was it? Who did this?" Moretti didn't answer directly. Instead, she turned to a monitor on the wall. "Before we get to that, there's something you need to see. We recovered several hidden cameras from your home. They were placed by Andre." Harrison frowned, confused. "Why would Dre do that?" "He was trying to show you something," Moretti said, and pressed play. The footage was grainy, shot from odd angles, but the audio was clear. The first clip showed the kitchen. Vivian was cooking, while Dre sat at the island, pretending to do homework. "We need to talk," Dre's voice said, tight with suppressed anger. "There's nothing to talk about, sweetheart," Vivian replied, her tone light and dismissive as she chopped vegetables. "You know what you did to me that night." Vivian stopped chopping. She turned, and for the first time, her perfect smiling facade dropped. The face she showed her stepson was cold, hard, and utterly devoid of warmth. "You were drunk, Andre. You don't know what you're talking about. You're confused." I'm not confused, Dre's voice rose. I'm sick because of you. Vivian let out a short, cruel laugh. Oh, please. Who is anyone going to believe? Me or the troubled teenage boy who can't handle his liquor? Maybe you got it from one of those little girls you're always chasing. Or maybe, she said, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper as she leaned closer, I should just tell your father you're gay. That would explain everything, wouldn't it? It would certainly be easier for him to accept than your disgusting little fantasy. On the screen, Dre recoiled as if struck. In the interrogation room, Harrison Sinclair made a choked, strangled sound. He stared at the monitor, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. This wasn't the woman he knew. This was a stranger, a cruel, manipulative monster wearing his wife's face. Moretti played another clip. This one was in the living room. Dre confronted her again, more forcefully this time. Vivian's response was even more chilling. You should be grateful, she hissed, her voice low and menacing. I gave you a taste of what a real woman is. Now you know, but you will keep your mouth shut. If you ever breathe a word of this to your father, I will destroy you. I will ruin your football career, your college prospects, everything. I will tell the world you attacked me, and they will believe me. The video ended. The room was silent, save for the sound of Harrison Sinclair's ragged breathing. He stared at the blank screen, his entire world, his entire marriage, the very memory of the woman he loved, collapsing into dust around him. The saint he had mourned was a demon. The perfect life he thought he had was a meticulously crafted lie. He looked at Moretti, his eyes empty. My boy, he whispered, the words catching in his throat. My son, he did this because of her. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of dawning, unbearable truth. Moretti nodded slowly. The man who killed Vivian has confessed. He said Andre paid him to do it. Harrison Sinclair didn't rage. He didn't scream. He simply broke. He slumped forward in his chair, his body convulsing with silent, agonizing sobs. He had not lost one family member, but two. His wife had been murdered, and his son was the one who had signed her death warrant. The perfect picture was not just shattered, it had been burned to ashes, and the truth was the fire that had consumed it all. The Sinclair case exploded across Atlanta, then the nation. It was a perfect storm for the media, a salacious cocktail of wealth, sex, betrayal, and murder set against the backdrop of the city's black elite. The story that had begun behind the closed doors of a Buckhead mansion was now being dissected on 24-hour news channels and debated on social media. The narrative was instantly polarizing. Was Andre Dre Sinclair a cold-blooded patricidal planner who hired a killer to eliminate his stepmother? Or was he a tragic victim, a child pushed to an unthinkable act by an even more unthinkable crime? The element of race, always simmering beneath the surface in the South, boiled over. Some conservative news outlets framed the story with barely concealed glee, using it as a told-you-so example of moral decay and violence hidden beneath the veneer of black success. They painted Dre as a monster, a product of a broken culture. Conversely, many in the black community and beyond rallied to his defense, seeing him as a victim of a justice system that often fails to protect young black men, especially from abuse that happens within the home. Justice for Dre began trending online. For Gabby Moretti, the media circus was a sickening distraction from the human tragedy at its core. She saw the case not in black and white, but in shades of devastating gray. She had solved the murder, but the concept of justice felt hollow and inadequate. How could there be justice when every single person involved was irrevocably broken? The trial was a spectacle. The prosecution, under immense public pressure, pushed for a first-degree murder charge, portraying Dre as a vengeful and calculating killer. They presented the evidence of his meticulous planning, the dark web research, the Bitcoin payments, the hiring of a contract killer. But Dre's defense team, led by one of the best lawyers in the country and funded by a guilt-ridden Harrison Sinclair, presented a powerful counter-narrative. They played the hidden camera footage for the jury, forcing them to witness Vivian Sinclair's chilling cruelty. They brought in psychologists who testified about the profound trauma of sexual assault and an HIV diagnosis, arguing that Dre was suffering from a form of extreme emotional disturbance, a young mind shattered by betrayal. They argued that his actions, while wrong, were not born of malice, but of desperation. In the end, the jury was torn. They found him guilty, but on the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter. The judge, taking into account the extraordinary and mitigating circumstances, sentenced him to 10 years in a juvenile correctional facility, with the possibility of parole after 7. It was a verdict that satisfied no one and angered everyone. Some screamed that it was a slap on the wrist for orchestrating a murder. Others cried that any jail time at all was an injustice for a boy who had already been handed a life sentence. Years later, after the headlines faded and the TV crews moved on to the next tragedy, Moretti would sometimes think about the Sinclairs. Harrison had sold the mansion and moved away, a recluse broken by grief and guilt. Dre was serving his time, his future as a football star replaced by the harsh reality of life behind bars. Vivian was in her grave, her public legacy as a saint forever tarnished, her tombstone a silent testament to the darkness she hid so well. The lesson, if there was one to be found in the ashes of the Sinclair family, was a sobering one. Moretti realized that the most dangerous secrets are not the ones we keep from the world, but the ones we keep from those we claim to love. They fester in the dark, breeding resentment and rage, until they grow powerful enough to consume everything. The case taught her that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about acknowledging that a single story can hold more than one victim. The hardest part of her job, she concluded, wasn't finding the guilty party. It was learning to live with the knowledge that in a world of profound human failing, sometimes the only thing left to do is to count the scars and hope that someday they might begin to heal.